Well, let me start, Noel, by thanking you for the invitation. It's always a great pleasure to be back in New York, but especially in the FPA. And Wolfgang, to you, thank you for that very generous introduction. I'll share with you all the fact one of the things I'm doing in Wales, this All Wales Convention, I work very closely with the Archbishop of Wales. Oddly enough, he takes time off from his day job to get heavily involved in the politics of Wales. But he came on a recent visit to New York. He'd not been before, was met at the airport, and to his surprise had to do an impromptu press conference. Did the press conference, but halfway through, a wizened reporter from Brooklyn said, "Say, Archbishop, are you going to visit any of our famous strip clubs in New York?" So the Archbishop, slightly nonplussed, but very tactfully said, "Are there any strip clubs in New York?" and passed on. And that morning when he woke up, he was still quite pleased with himself, the way he'd handled the question, until he saw the morning newspaper under his door, whose headlines said, "Limey Archbishop, first question, are there any strip clubs in New York?" So, this capacity to be misunderstood, evident. It's 30 years, almost to the day, but I started work on the European Community, as it then was, 3 days after Margaret Thatcher actually came to power. And that sparked in me a conversion to multilateral diplomacy, a long stint, as you heard, in the European Union, then NATO, and finally the United Nations. What you've got in front of you is an unapologetic advocate for multilateralism. And I particularly welcome, therefore, the subject of our discussions today. And my theme is going to be straightforward and hardly novel. The challenges we now confront are global, they're interrelated, as you've been hearing. They demand multilateral approaches to tackle them. Most multilateral organizations, as well as countries, need to contribute to finding solutions, and the solutions are more likely to be found if you have a multilateral coordinated response to the challenge. And I want to seek to illustrate how that applies in terms of the work of the European Union, to human rights, and to the achievement of the MDGs. Now, as you heard, the European Union, the United Nations, they share many common values and objectives. Each is committed to the maintenance of peace, the promotion of international security, and, crucially, to the principles of justice and international law. Both are wedded to economic, social, and humanitarian cooperation, to respect for human rights, and to individual freedoms. Member states of the EU are resolved to reinforce their European identity in order to promote peace, security, and progress worldwide. That's the commitment, the fundamental principles which underpin the external policies of the EU. And I don't think they're just external. They have to apply internally too. Because as someone said in a famous judgment in the Supreme Court of the United States not so long ago, if you go out there and espouse principles and values, you really ought to make sure that you practice the same values domestically. And that has to apply to all of us. Because none of us, as we look at human rights, none of us is above reproach. Remember that. The EU, the UN, were in many ways complementary. The principles of the Charter actually informed much of the philosophy of the founding Treaty of Rome. More recently, that cooperation put into sharp focus by the deployment of a EU military force to eastern Chad to provide protection to all those internally displaced people and refugees. That deployment, covered by a Security Council resolution, was intended as the precursor to UN peacekeeping presence on the ground. The same way, the European Union, some years ago, deployed to eastern Congo for just the same reason: rapid deployment with the support, the authority of the Security Council, but for UN goals. Now, those for me are simple examples of the EU and the UN working in the closest partnership for the best of reasons. I could add that NATO, for me, shares many of those same principles and objectives. Now, the second subject today, human rights. You heard a lot this afternoon about the UN Declaration, which is a remarkable document. It sets out fundamental rights to which each person is entitled purely by virtue of their humanity. The rights necessary to secure basic human dignity, the well-being of each person. Now, as Una outlined earlier on, the Declaration is very clear that human rights are not just civil and political, but they're also economic, social, and cultural. Not just freedom from fear, but freedom from want. In short, human rights are interdependent, they're indivisible. You can't enjoy your economic and social rights if you're denied your full political and civil rights, or vice versa. Political, economic rights must be advanced together, not just one as an alternative to the other. Now, human rights, of course, don't exist in a vacuum. They're a commitment, a contract between the state and its citizen to guarantee them not just freedom from oppression, but the freedom of opportunity. In short, a government, in ratifying international human rights instruments, makes a commitment to fulfill its obligation to provide a basic standard of living to all its citizens, as well as to promote and protect their basic freedoms. That means, in part, having the institutions, the infrastructure in place to share the gains of globalization among the population. In other words, the ability to respect and advance political and civil rights to help reap the full benefits of the economic and social rights. Human development, for me, is a process of enhancing human capabilities so that people have more choices and opportunities, and each person can lead a life of respect and values. And it should be fairly obvious that we'll never end poverty, attain the MDGs on any durable basis without certain guarantees. And for me, these include some very simple ones. That states will not abuse power or act corruptly, that citizens will not be arbitrarily discriminated against when they go to a health center or go to school, that individuals should have the right ultimately to choose how they are governed and by whom. So human rights can't be advanced in a vacuum. They require sound economic and social foundations. A simple example, trafficking in women and children, one of the most appalling abuses of basic human rights, will only be stopped, in my view, completely when the underlying socio-economic causes, such as poverty, the lack of education, when they've been addressed, then we have some chance of actually stopping that problem. Similarly, the effective and well-judged implementation of labor standards with international assistance and cooperation, preferably from business and unions. This can play an important part in the reduction of global poverty and in achieving the MDGs. The social argument rests on the importance of core labor standards as basic rights in eliminating discrimination, reducing the risks of wasting skills and capabilities, and improving opportunities for the disadvantaged. Labor rights, of course, can also contribute to social and political development. Freedom of association is a fundamental right, and labor organizations, certainly in Europe, have traditionally played a key role in the development of responsive democratic policies and politics. Overall, that approach doesn't actually hinder the competitiveness of industry, as is often alleged, but rather develops the economic case, in my view, for investment where you have social and economic stability becoming more likely because of the policies. But what's inescapable is that the problems in the South, poverty, disease, lack of education, and more, they present real challenges in the implementation of human rights, good governance, and democracy. So the North can't concentrate just on the old priorities of civil and political rights, if indeed rights are indivisible. Then we need the comprehensive strategy, and that strategy is in the Millennium Development Goals. It was set out in the Millennium Declaration to tackle all aspects of human development. Development brings poverty relief, increases the levels of education, improves housing, gives equitable access to resources. But it can also provide, and this is key, provides the political structures, the democratic legitimacy necessary to sustain progress. There's a human rights aspect in all of the MDGs, and each of the MDGs in turn is relevant to the promotion of different parts of human rights in their broader sense. So for sustainable development, economic development, and better civil and political rights go hand in hand. Now, some of you know I don't normally use a prepared text, but I'm conscious that one of my ambassadorial colleagues, who was notoriously unpopular with his staff and did always use a text, and always read, without having previously read it at all, the text that had been put before him. And on one famous occasion, he came to the bottom of page 3 and it said, I have 3 proposals now to make to tackle this fundamental problem which I've outlined. And they are, and he turned over and he said, you're on your own. Well, of course, one of the things you notice about being an ex-ambassador is you no longer have anyone who's going to draft anything for you. So I can only blame myself for this. It's true also because the way you identify an ex-ambassador, it's somebody who gets in the back seat of the car and sits there wondering why it doesn't start. So what are our aims? An end to abject poverty and underdevelopment. Instead, economic prosperity spread as widely as possible, and stable, peaceful societies that respect human rights and the rule of law. But none of these, it's come up earlier this afternoon, none is attainable without the others. To achieve all these elements of human development simultaneously, we need to protect, promote all human rights at the same time. We also have a moral duty to speak up for them and to stand up against their flagrant abuse. Human rights, therefore, have a preeminent importance, it seems to me. But human rights, the rule of law, democratic structures, they're crucial in states emerging from conflict. But so too are security, humanitarian relief, and economic prospects. Each is a necessary and essential element of the transition to stability after conflict. Security, including policing, always an immediate challenge. But the lessons of Iraq, of Liberia, Afghanistan, East Timor, they're clear. These elements cannot be treated sequentially. Each has to be tackled immediately to the extent possible. There won't be security without development, and there won't be any enduring prosperity without that security. And each is supported by that key third pillar: justice, rights, rule of law, democratic institutions. Sierra Leone also underlines another element, that the stability within a state is also dependent on combating contagious and harmful influences outside the state. Hence the need also to take account of the regional dimension when addressing post-conflict situations in a particular country. Now let me try and turn to some of the challenges that we confront, beginning with food security. And we heard a lot about that in the earlier panel. But it took humanity 10,000 years to expand global food production to 5 billion tons a year. But the sad news is that by 2050, the world will be consuming twice that amount. So we've got 40 years to do what previously took 10,000. By 2050, it's estimated that world's cereal demand will be at least 60% higher. Why? Well, the drivers, they include the expected population increase, rising per capita incomes, notwithstanding the present financial crisis, a growing demand for livestock products, increasing water and land scarcity, a growing demand for biofuels. We just quote you, 1/3 of the United States maize crop goes in ethanol production, 1/3 of European Union rapeseed production this year will go for biodiesel. The impact of climate change, I'll come back to that, all those issues, and the lack of any substantial increase in productivity in food production, they're all major problems which explain why we have a huge challenge ahead. Now, we heard earlier about the spike in food prices in 2007, 2008, which threw 100 million extra people into extreme poverty. It added to 850 million chronically undernourished, 180 million children underweight, and 40 million women of childbearing age who are anemic. Despite the hike in prices, it's one stark factor that developing country farmers did not respond to the increase in price. There was no extra production. Why is that? Partly because high cost of fertilizers, insufficient access to technology, lack of education as to what one should do, and crucially, lack of infrastructure and unreliable markets. You can add to it lack of water. But let me quote you one terrible statistic, that 50% of food produced in Africa does not get to market. 50% gets wasted. So access to water is a particularly difficult problem in the developing world. Agriculture consumes 85% of fresh water use in this world. Waterborne disease and lack of sanitation, a major cause of death at the same time. Now, strikingly, people in this room, on average, consume 2 liters of water each per day. The food you consume daily takes 2,000 to 3,000 liters of water to produce. Just think about that. You can drink 2 liters, and the food you consume took up to 3,000 liters each to produce. Yet in Africa, there is minimal irrigation. Gordon Conway, well known in New York, has argued that water use productivity has to be more closely linked to land use productivity. But crucially, we need in Africa another green revolution, which we saw in Asia, but which Africa has not experienced. Again, an appalling figure. Over the last 50 years, crop yields in China went up by a factor of 4. Crop yields in Africa over the same period stayed constant. The continent needs a sustainable, environmentally friendly transformation of its agriculture, and a transformation which must benefit the poor. And that will require a more skillful labor force. It will require access to technology, fertilizers, pesticides, crucially to water, and in particular, biotechnology which can produce seeds capable of countering pests and disease, showing increased drought intolerance, and also a capacity to withstand at the same time, floods. I read something this morning with UNDP about grasses which can now stay submerged underwater for 2 weeks and yet recover, but quite crucial in terms of the weather that they will subsequently face. So yields in Africa could be substantially increased, and those increased yields are actually needed too in Asia, simply because there's very little uncultivated land left on that continent, and where more than half the world's population live. Ghana has demonstrated what is possible. Between 1993 and 2003, the number of malnourished was reduced by more than a half, meeting actually the first MDG. Maize yields increased by 36%, cassava by 50%. There's been a strong growth in smallholder production of cocoa and pineapples. Market liberalization and new rural infrastructure have actually encouraged agricultural production. And if I go down to the Brazilian Cerrado, 100 million hectares of what was formerly highly acidic marginal land has been converted now into some of the richest productive farmlands in Latin America. How? Not rocket science, thanks to lime, fertilizer, and effective weed control. Now, there may be some in this audience, though I doubt it, who will remember that North American wheat production in 1950-54 was actually substantially affected by rust fungus. I'd not heard about rust fungus until recently, but what I do know now is that it's re-emerging in Asia, and it is only rice among all the cereals which actually can resist the fungus. So the challenge for the researcher is very simple. Transfer the genetic immunity that exists in rice, get it quickly into your wheat, because otherwise you may face a repetition of 1950-54. Agriculture needs to be able to use new technologies, but within what seems to me a better regulatory framework. Increased agricultural production, therefore, essential. But to achieve it, there needs to be a more substantial investment in global agriculture, in research and development, and of course in infrastructure and markets. It's a sad fact of life that official development assistance from most of the donors and from most of the agencies has actually neglected agriculture these last 10, 15 years. The need to come back to agriculture to get all the donors to acknowledge that investment in food security actually is required, and very urgently so. Because crop production is increasingly targeted too at helping achieve energy security, itself one of our key challenges. But both are going to be challenged by one of the biggest threats that we face, climate change. Now, thankfully, and in the short time that I've been away, there's now greater and perhaps near total acceptance that we face a man-made crisis and not some cyclical change in the weather pattern. But the challenge is immense. If we stopped all emissions tomorrow, we'd still need to cope with the consequences of centuries of human behavior. And of course, limiting and reducing today's emissions is a daunting task. The short-term priority, a global agreement at Copenhagen in December, which reduces emissions, thus mitigating further damage, but which also encourages adaptation. Now, I asked somebody in UNDP this morning, what do you mean by adaptation? This always seemed to be a term that is used in different contexts. But the answer I got was adaptation means actually growing things in a way that takes account of the climate which results from climate change. Well, I think that's only part of it. The other bits of adaptation are, if you've got new emission limits, how do you adapt so that you actually conform to the obligations you take on? And crucially, the third bit of adaptation is, how do you adapt to new technology? How do you find new technologies and apply them? Crucially in all that, of course, to stop deforestation. And the thing about deforestation is it doesn't just contribute some 16% of the emissions that go up, but it's a double whammy, because then there are fewer trees around to actually photosynthesize the carbon dioxide that is emitted. So major requirement there. Because if climate change threatens us all, it threatens developing countries in particular. They face higher temperatures, greater, more intense rainfall, and at the same time, paradoxically, more drought, riverbank erosion, more intense cyclones, and saltwater incursions, as we saw last year in Myanmar. And as the Deputy Foreign Minister of the Maldives told the Security Council in April 2007, and people argued, was this a threat to security? Well, he said, my state faces the prospect of disappearing under the rising sea if the temperature goes up by 1.5 degrees centigrade. I can think, he said, of no greater threat to the security of my state than that it should not exist. And that's the answer to those who say that climate change is not a problem. Poor people will bear a disproportionate share of the negative impacts of climate change. They'll be concentrated in areas where the effect will be early, severe, and yet where there are limited economic and institutional capacities to cope. It's not an exaggeration to say that climate change threatens poverty reduction, economic development, and even the destruction of traditional lifestyles. Just think, the same increase in water level would mean that 30 million people in Bangladesh would have to go live somewhere else. Not an easy choice. Oxfam produced a comprehensive report on what I'll call the climatic changes, the weather occurring today in Uganda. More erratic rainfall in March, June is reducing crop yields. The end-of-year rain now falls much more intensely. It causes floods, landslides, soil erosion. Rangeland-related conflicts are more prevalent. There's an increase in disease among both humans and animals. Fish stocks are declining, and food security is worsening. Water is scarcer, bringing itself local conflict. 99% of rural Ugandans use wood or charcoal for fuel, increasing emissions and at the same time erosion. Now, I'm not going to claim, because Oxfam didn't claim, that those effects are directly attributable to climate change. But they are, I think, precursors of what climate change will do, and what they demonstrate only too clearly is the vulnerability of ordinary people to the consequences of what happens to the weather. I'm using the word weather so as not to prejudice the argument, but if it's weather or sustainable climate change, the effect on the ground is the same. It's very, very bad news. And the prognosis for 2090 for Africa is quite simple, that the north and the south are going to become much more prone to drought, and the central belt will be wetter and less prone to drought. So development policy has to take account of the consequences of climate change and the measures needed to encourage adaptation in developing countries. Not as part of existing assistance, it seems to me, but as an additional effort. Stearns did us all, I think, a very great favor by pointing out it'll cost the world much less to take action than it will actually to sit back and take the consequences of climate change. Amelioration of the consequences is what we should now be doing. Now, as an example, let me simply quote that last week the Asian Development Bank warned that the Philippines, Thailand, Indonesia, and Vietnam faced a loss of some 6.7% of GDP by 2100 if carbon emissions are maintained at their present levels. And another simple example, the drought in 2006-07 cost Australia 1% of its GNP. That's the scale of the impact that the weather is having. I should also, at this stage, tell you, I hadn't delivered this speech before, but when I was last in this city, one of my colleagues used to go off regularly, once a week at least, delivering a speech entitled, "Is the United Nations Future Behind It?" And he came out one night, jumped in the car, and the driver said, "Where are we going?" And forgive me, Noel, he said, "We're going to Yale." And he said, "What are you speaking on?" He said, "Is the United Nations future?" And he said, "Oh, not again," said the driver. And the driver said, "Yeah, I bet you I could deliver that speech. I could deliver it word perfect because I've heard it so many times." So the ambassador said, "Well, they don't know me up there. I'll take the bet. You deliver the speech." So he did. The ambassador sat in the audience pretending to be the driver, and the driver delivered the speech perfectly. The first question was an absolute sod, of course. Dissected the main principle of the speech and put forward a counter proposition. And the driver looked at the question and said, "You know, that is such a dumb, stupid question. I'm going to ask my driver to answer it." Now, can I come back to the theme of linkages? Cows are a major source of methane emissions. Research has shown, very simply, that bovine emissions are reduced when cows are fed grasses with less sugar content. If you can actually produce grasses which are resistant to drought, have that quality, you'll be actually meeting many objectives at the same time. Was it something I said that everybody's leaving at this stage?
All the drivers are leaving.
Yes, well. Everybody did leave me once, actually. I was left with one person who came up to me and I said, "Well, thank you very much for staying to the end." And the person said, "I'm a caretaker, I have to lock up after you." Drought or excess water will reduce crop yields unless, crucially, we produce new resistant plant varieties. Not just produce, but actually teach farmers and give them the means to actually plant them and then actually grow them and harvest and send them to market. If we don't, it's not just the effect on crop production. Climate change will exacerbate the potential triggers of conflict. It will increase the use of biofuels. It will lessen food security. And we'll end up that we're worse off in all directions. And yet, if you can enhance energy security sensibly through biofuels, at the same time you would then reduce Western dependency on hydrocarbons from geopolitically less stable areas. Those things go together really rather neatly if you could make it work. Now, I haven't got this far without a need to mention the immediate challenge, the worst financial crisis since 1945. It has its roots in many places and several causes, and there can be no doubting its impact. New York, noticeably quieter today, but more importantly, what it's doing to the developing world. If G8 economies are in recession, world trade will shrink this year by, well, at least for the first time in 25 years, it's going to decrease. Developing countries, who after all didn't cause this crisis, are the ones who are going to suffer disproportionately. Private capital flows to the developing countries this year are likely to be about $200 million, compared with $1 trillion 2 years ago. And in case people get confused, I should have said 200 billion, and I did mean 1 trillion, so it's a factor of 1/5 of what they were. That's the scale of the reduction. Remittances, crucial to the developing world, which tended to average about $280 billion, are falling rapidly. And as recently as January 2008, the World Bank projected the developing countries would grow by 7% this year. The current projection, and declining rapidly, is 2%. In India, industrial production is slowing from double to low single-figure growth. In Latin America, 40% of financial wealth has been wiped out in the first 11 months of last year. In Zambia, well, 27% of mining jobs lost In Cambodia, 15% of jobs in the garment industry, and so on. And if world demand is a major driver of prosperity for us, it's a bigger driver for the prosperity of the developing countries. The IMF used to say, but if you had 1% of GDP growth in OECD, then that would generate 0.5% of growth in sub-Saharan Africa. So what happens now? That interrelationship is why the G20 meeting in London in April very sensibly addressed a number of issues. And I'll briefly say, to restore growth and jobs, to strengthen the financial system through better surveillance and regulation, to fund and reform the IFIs, to combat protectionism, including, very crucially, imports from low-income countries, and put in place a transparent monitoring system. And ultimately, to build a green, sustainable recovery, and what they said, and I hope they believed, meet the MDGs and honour aid pledges. The need to meet in April was obvious, as was the requirement for coordinated, decisive action to stimulate economies and global growth. The outcomes, in principle, they were good, provided now crucially that the commitments taken on are actually honoured. And disturbingly, some countries, and in Europe, are already failing to meet their aid promises, and protectionist steps are being taken in a number of countries. A big boost all round, and we've been saying this for years, would be a successful conclusion of the Doha round, but that still seems elusive. But at least the summit recognized the need to ensure social protection for the hardest hit through a rapid response social fund. Because budgets for basic health, education, and nutritional needs have to be protected. Bob Zelig pointed out that that was not done in the Asian crisis, and with all the painful consequences of that, but the need now for, as Zelig emphasized, for agriculture and infrastructure investment in the developing world, that has to be safeguarded. Because unless we safeguard it now, in the years to come, the many problems will be even worse than they promised to be. So it only serves to underline, however difficult it may be in terms of public expenditure in all the countries of the North and, of course, elsewhere, commitments should be honoured if indeed development is to move forward, and crucially, if the MDGs aren't going to be further set back. I used to say that some of the MDGs were running slowly, and it wasn't 2015, it was 2.5 years ago, headed to be 2050 for some. Well, the risk is that we didn't bring it forward, and by 2050 was an underestimate, and that actually the delay will be even longer. The choice of G20 as a platform was significant, recognizing that the balance of economic power has been shifting, that middle income and developing countries need a voice and an equity in the proceedings. And for the longer term, again, the undertakings to complete new quota shares for both the IMF and the World Bank bear a step to a much needed direction if the IFIs are to be credible. Because if I'm an advocate of multilateralism, I have to recognize two tests for the legitimacy of a multilateral institution. The first, one of structure, that its membership, its values, processes, and decision-taking structures should be broadly acceptable. And second, that the decisions, the results of its endeavors should be widely appreciated and accepted. Best of all, that both tests should be met, that the organization has credibility and you like what it's doing. For me, the European Union is capable of doing both. It has a credible record in promoting peace and security, particularly on the European continent. And I highlight there what it's done from taking a community of 6 up to today's 27 member states. Those of us who can go back simply to remember what it was like in 1988 will realize that 10 countries then under totalitarian regimes are now part of the EU, and that 6 of them didn't actually exist as states in that form 21 years ago. That's the reality. But the EU has always stood for human rights globally. Its member states are among the strongest defenders of and the largest contributors to the United Nations system. There's a huge scope for cooperation between the two organizations in development, in the application of European security and defense policies, in the continued voice for rights and the rule of law, with a range of policies that the EU has both internally and, crucially, externally, in order to help that they be delivered. They're the policies and the instruments through which the European Union and its member states deliver their development assistance and contribute to the achievement of the MDGs. The latest figure I've got is that in 2006, members of the EU provided £32 billion of aid, which is more than half the total global development assistance for that year. So it's not a bad achievement. I claim that in terms of what said earlier this afternoon, that the acceptance of the 0.7% target for 2015, what it's saying about gaseous emissions and binding limits on those, the EU is trying to take on a leadership role. But, like all of us, it has to do much better. Because I don't want to sound complacent. The European Union has to be on its mettle to deliver what it has pledged and what its member states have said they will do. And it has to do more, realistically, given the scale of the present crisis and the challenges that we all confront. That will require enormous political will to deliver on promises made and improve the efficiency of what is already being done. And to do that at a time when the pressure internally for public expenditure constraint is enormous. It's not a good time to be in government in any country, but especially, it seems to me, in OECD countries. What we need is a recognition, too, that the EU has a wider interest. It's not just promoting the prosperity of its own people, but that wider interest is justice and a fairer global distribution of economic benefit for the whole world. And nowhere is that more evident than in the case of international trade policy, where completing Doha would be a wonderful boost for the developing countries, but where there is, I think, a particular obligation on the EU, like the United States, that both need to do better. Whatever their difficulties, of course, developing countries have matching obligations. Not much is said about it, but let me be quite clear. I think each developing country, if these resources are to be made available, if these changes happen, then they have an obligation to put programs in place nationally to implement the Millennium Development Goals. Secondly, and it's linked, of course, to ensure that their citizens enjoy both political and economic rights in their broader sense. In short, but their governments too deliver on what they have signed up to do. The United Nations is full of norms and values, objectives, things that people have said they will do. Where we are all not good is on the implementation. And that's where, of course, much more has to happen. Hiding behind the argument about thou shalt not interfere in the sovereignty of another state is just not a good enough argument. Being prepared to actually identify those cases of abuse of human rights, to stand up for values and what needs to be done, that's an obligation on the developing as well as on the developed. And developing countries rightly claim that they have little responsibility for climate change. Of course, they need to grow economically. But what we've got to do is work with them to find ways to transfer technology, to permit the growth, but without exacerbating climate change or repeating the mistakes of the 20th century, which OECD countries did, partly because they didn't know any better. we do now know much better, and we have to do better. So can I finish where I started in addressing the European Union, rights, the Millennium Development Goals? I hope I've brought out some of the complexities which have been part of a discussion all afternoon. The fact that there is no independent variable in a mathematical sense in all of this, but there are so many cross-linkages and interrelations. They're everywhere. The challenge to respond, put simply, demands a multilateral approach, where the positive contributions of any state or organization has to be harnessed in a coordinated action. The challenges, they are truly immense. I don't want to say historic because that's an abused adjective, but they are immense. But it seems to me that the multilateral approach, the efforts of the UN and other organizations, offers the best prospect of trying to pull through to meet these concerns, and in particular to develop a better tomorrow for the developing countries. We finish with what the Millennium Declaration said, and I think it put it very well. Only through broad and sustainable efforts to create a shared future based on our common humanity in all its diversity can globalization be made fully inclusive and equitable. Thank you very much.
We'll give those people who want to leave an opportunity to do so, but Ambassador Jones-Perry has very graciously agreed to take some questions.
It was longer than half an hour, wasn't it? Anybody want to put me on the spot? Please.
Yes, I have a question. You talked about multilateral cooperation when it comes to governments. I was looking at some figures lately on the financial crisis, and I saw that the global financial system, the derivatives market and the equities markets and securities in general, it's much larger than the global GDP, if I got it right. I mean, it's huge anyway. So I'm just wondering whether, in combining all the financial crisis and the climate change and all these problems that we have and we're going to see in the future, whether it's the governments or the multilateral corporate organizations are sufficient in combating them, or there should be something more that has to be done with the capital corporations.
Can you please repeat the question?
I think the question was, is there any more that should be done over and above what is currently in train to try and encourage financial cooperation to tackle these problems?
If I'm to repeat that, I said that the global financial, the capital, the global financial, the markets are much bigger than the GDP, the combined GDP of the various countries around the world. That's my understanding. And I just wanted to see whether, just talking about what the countries and the governments can do in combating the financial crisis is sufficient. Like very recently, I just saw the data. For example, the oil just started to rise as we had like a small improvement in the stock market. So
Yeah.
that actually worked.
I don't want to dodge the question, but the great minds in what they've been trying to address in the past 18 months, a lot of them are totally confused, if not surprised. People who've been 40 years in the banking industry say, well, I no longer have the slightest idea what is happening. And that's because the whole thing got out of control. And I was saying to Gonzalo over coffee, what intrigues me is they're all making these losses. Where did it go? Because, if we all go gambling tonight, and if there are 4 of us gambling and 2 of us lose, you assume the other 2 have won. But it looks at the moment as though everybody's losing. And the sums are, they're out of sight. The British obligation that we've taken on to fund our banks, are many times GDP. The amazing thing is that banks and the debts they took on were actually so much greater than GDP. The whole thing was disproportionately out of kilter. My assumption is that in the different things that the G20 came up with, against the political and practical constraints, they did just about everything that was possible because, frankly, they threw the kitchen sink at it. Anymore, I'm not at all sure what it is. And I was chastened. I was talking to a number of school kids about a month ago, and at one stage they got onto the financial crisis, and I tried to do a little bit of an explanation. And one of them just looked at me and said, "So you mean our generation is for the rest of our lives going to have to pay for the consequences of the mismanagement by the few who are now drawing all these pensions?" And I didn't, as I demonstrated to you, I haven't going to answer that question either. The answer is yes, I think. Please.
Yes, I was wondering what you thought about the new push in China to have clean coal burning plants.
Well,
What was the question?
what I think of the push in China to have clean coal-firing plants. The fact is they're opening how many new plants per week, and it's a major contribution, of course, to the emissions. But the challenge for the rest of us is, can we deny China economic development, an economic development which is actually helping to pull the rest of us along quite nicely as well? It's a major contribution to global growth. And the lesson has to be that somebody out there, given you need an energy policy which actually makes sense, which tackles, one, the use of, secondly, has different sources to produce energy, and maximizes what you can do on renewables. But in Britain they demonstrated quite easily the other day that if we wanted to meet all our electrical requirements from renewables, the whole of my nation, Wales, would have to be covered by wind turbines entirely, just in order to produce what Britain needs. There's a limit to what is possible renewable. So a sensible basis for nuclear has to be found, which means coping with reprocessing, with getting rid of waste and so on. But I don't see how you can do without it. And crucially, if we're going to have more coal-fired, and the United States has made clear that coal is part of its long-term energy future, somebody has to do something with capturing the carbon. And it's not enough to say, well, as the British government has been saying, we're going to open new coal-fired power stations and we're going to develop technology and we're going to be a world leader. The assertion doesn't deliver because there is no British technology to actually sequester carbon dioxide. And what you've got to do, very simply, is put something at the top of a stack and take it all down and either compress it, liquefy it, or somehow absorb it in something so that carbon dioxide doesn't go up. And it's a massive problem. It sounds very simple, but nobody yet has an answer to it. But they better damn well find it soon. Please.
Good evening. My name is Arnisha Watson, and I'm an international student here from Jamaica studying at Brooklyn College. And my question is, the European Union seems to be a success story to me, at least, over the past, its growth in the past 20 or so years. And I'm curious to know, is the European Union and the UN working with nations in, developing regions like Africa and the Caribbean to promote greater state interrelation to promote development? Because, I think the European Union, especially not so long ago, it wasn't as, there were critics saying that, sovereignty nations will not be able to work together to, on a common goal to unite or to improve their region. And I think if the European Union stands now as somewhat of a success story in its effort, then it should be working with regions like the Caribbean and African nations to perhaps set some kind of developmental strategies for internal development for those regions rather than just pouring in external assistance.
Well, the short answer is I agree with you 100%, because I come from a nation which hasn't quite reconciled itself to sharing sovereignty with the European Union. So we have this in permanent tussle are we prepared to? But the theory is very simple, that in areas where there is sensible benefit to cooperate at the supranational level, you do so, environment now being a classic, because as a nation state, you can't actually do it alone. And the lesson of climate change is it's even above the European Union. It's got to be global if it's going to work. But I've got to pay tribute to the EU in terms of its trade policies, the concessions it has been giving for the last 30 years to the developing world, the European Development Fund and the sums it disperses, and the whole, what used to be Yaoundé, Lomé, and is now the Conakry Treaty, taking in, 77 developing countries and their relations with the EU. It does a lot, should do more, but where you're absolutely right is the EU as an exemplar, best demonstrated on the European continent, where for the Balkans, the simple message to the Balkans is, if you can, one, as individual countries, adopt the norms and values that the EU claims, two, in your relationship between each other, you can have the sort of relations that Germany and France developed post-1945. And thirdly, meet both those conditions, and we'll bring you closer to Brussels and to eventual membership of the EU. And that as a foreign policy instrument has been very powerful on the European continent. The exemplar model for ECOWAS in West Africa, for the Caribbean, it's there. And it needn't be political, giving up sovereignty, but economic, practical cooperation. There's a huge amount that can be done and should be done. And you can take that also to the Pacific Islands, where it's always seemed to me, but as nation states, the bigger states in the EU, pull out and no longer have representation, there's a vacuum for the EU to go in and represent us all, and not just, as you say, distribute aid, but actually look to try and encourage structures which will actually offer stability and a prospect of progress in all directions.
Yes, if I may. You mentioned the famous speech, the future, what was it? The future of the United Nations is behind us, or something like this. And I want to tie a rather serious question to this famous speech, which I'd like to hear one day. Isn't there a tendency now in world politics to find new fora of working together, like the G20? And isn't, in certain areas, aren't nations and aren't governments trying to bypass the United Nations?
No, I don't think they're trying to bypass, the UN. They are trying to say that the IFIs, the World Bank and the IMF, haven't given them sufficient representation, and that the days when fundamental policy for the American, British, French, German governments was, we have quota shares and we're going to hang on to those and we're not going to reduce anything. In the real world we live in, we do not dominate that much economically, and other people have to have their voices heard. Where the UN comes in is that A, it's global, and B, the Security Council and what it does when it acts under Chapter 7 with the right language, that's binding on 192 nations. And there's nothing I know of that's no substitute for that. That's the binding capacity of the UN to act. And for those who believe that a union of democratic states or something could supplant, then that's for the birds.
Thank you. My name is Richard Field, active in the American Bar Association. On climate change, global warming, and I want to take advantage of your scientific expertise, and I understand and agree with the scientific evidence. But in a way, as a devil's advocate, why isn't global warming a zero-sum game? In that, unless you decide that everybody's temperature today around the world is the optimal perfect temperature, some will gain and some will lose. You say some in the Sahara will now have water. Why isn't it zero-sum? What's the argument to counter that? Is it just that change is disruptive, whether it's global warming, global cooling, or anything else? And does that have implications for free marketers who say, the market will change quickly, but it will come to a equilibrium. Does it have implications for the internet? That says, fundamental disruption is just a byproduct. Is actually the fundamental disruption the essence of the issue here? Rather than where it ends up.
Sure, I don't think it is. And I try to talk about the weather rather than climate change to respect the argument of those who say this is cyclical. And there is an argument that says that there's an 11-year cycle of hotspots on the sun, and that the classic example is somewhere between 1730 and 1750, say, Britain was very cold and the Thames froze, and it happened to coincide with a period where there was no sunspot activity recorded. And since 1500 they've been recording sunspot. So people say, it's the normal cycle. Well, I don't think it is the normal cycle. The science, as you admit in the question, from all the experts pretty well, so 95% of them believe that this is man-made and it's a permanent problem. Why I think it's not just disruptive change, it's dramatic change, and it's final change. If you live in the Maldives, if you live in lower Bangladesh, there's nowhere to go. And of course, there are bits of Canada and Russia which are going to be warmer and they'll be better off. But that's more than compensated by all those countries who are going to be substantially worse off. And it's not just that they'll be a wee bit hotter, but what I try to describe as is now happening in Uganda is that it's so erratic, but its impact is disastrous. And it is disastrous in terms of what it does for agricultural production and so on. So we've got to adapt to that. And part of my simple argument is that includes technology. In Europe, we haven't, I think, grown up yet to accept GM sufficiently. But actually, we've been fiddling with seeds for as long as mankind has actually done agriculture. What's different is we're doing a bit more with stem cells now at the molecular level. But in practice, if you can have a plant which will resist the flood, but can actually carry on growing and will produce a better yield, then we better go there. Because if we don't, there will be sufficient disruption that actually agricultural production overall will drop really quite markedly. And against all the demands that we have, there's going to be major poverty and not enough food to go around. So it seems to me that's why we have to tackle it.
One last question.
Yes, when the dust settles, could you tell us what will development look like, the face of development? Will it follow the old neoliberal paradigm, or will we see a kinder, gentler capitalism, which Bill Gates is suggesting at the moment?
I don't know the answer, but there was an interesting article was in the FT last week by the president of Rwanda, who was arguing that the days of ODA were coming to an end. You had to cut the dependency, and actually countries had to sort it out for themselves. The long-term goal of development must be that you've got sustainable development, indigenously done. So we get to that, and if we've got capitalism working, but especially markets liberalized, what I do think is at the heart of this is market liberalization and access to markets. And that includes access to European markets from the developing world, where we've done quite well, but there's scope for doing much better. But of course, the paradox there is, when I go to the supermarket and say, I really fancy these Kenyan green beans, and my wife says, it's ridiculous. Why on earth are they wasting all that energy, etc., the carbon footprint of exporting those to Britain? And that's part of the argument. The other bit of the argument is, unless the Kenyans export such products, there isn't much else that they're actually going to be able to do. And again, it takes you directly into the consequences. One side is desirable, the other is an adverse reaction.
Emma, I know that at the FPA, as we look back on this conference, we will remember this as one of the most important that we have held, and I want to thank you for making it so.